introduce it and maybe stress the importance of this paper as it relates to our understanding of the modifiable risk factors for dementia as a whole, but then also for young onset dementia.
Yeah, so this paper came out in 2023, and it came out of a data set called the UK Biobank, which is a massive prospective data set, meaning collected from people as they age. And so the sample was of healthy people, mostly white, in multiple sites throughout the UK that were younger than 65. And the I think kind of hallmark of this study, the cornerstone of why it's interesting is a couple things. One, that it's a large data set. Two, it's prospective, collecting as we go, not retrospective, looking back at clinical charts and trying to pull from data that might not be perfect or only based on subjective report. And then three, that it's in young onset, which I kind of alluded to before, but young onset dementia is just a term that means a dementia that has been diagnosed under the age of 65. And so that population is smaller than the diagnosis of dementia after 65, which is a more typical age at which you'd see symptoms and make a clinical diagnosis of dementia.
Now, in terms of these being a neurodegenerative condition versus a reversible dementia, is that delineated in this paper?
So we're trusting that the diagnosis made by the physicians that saw these patients during the study and entered that ICD-10 or 9 code have made the diagnosis the way we just talked about.
Yeah. Okay.
So that they've ruled out reversibles and have made a diagnosis based on clinical exam and biomarkers.
Okay.
And so let's say that all of that was done well,
yeah,
reasonably well. This would be the first study of this magnitude that looked at multiple risk factors that had been proven out in late onset dementias over the age of 65 for years, but had only been tested piecemeal in smaller samples in younger populations. So, for example, ApoE4 has been tested in younger populations, and there's been some findings about risk there, or vitamin D, C-reactive protein, things like smoking and cardiovascular risk factors individually. Or in one study that was a little bit smaller, looked at 14 of these factors and tried to make sense of how they interact. But this study had a massive sample size that allowed them statistically to look at not only multiple factors and kind of have good confidence that these factors actually would be generalizable to other young people and young populations, but also how those factors interact with each other. And so I think we should probably come up with a metaphor or analogy to find why that's important. Maybe we can think about rebounds in basketball. If I could measure one thing to predict who's going to be the best rebounder, that's better than having to measure 2 or 3 things, right? And so who's going to be the best rebounder?
The tallest.
Somebody who's the tallest.
Guy, right.
Maybe somebody who's the tallest and reaches the highest. Maybe somebody's got longer arms and can reach higher even though his head height is about the same as other people. And so you might measure how high they can reach and how tall they are. But those things are going to be so correlated, it's probably going to be close to one-to-one correlation, right? And so I don't need to measure height and how high they reach, but I might measure height and vertical, how high they jump. Not everyone's jumping the same, and if some guy's very tall and jumps higher, he's probably getting more rebounds, let alone some other things that probably play into rebounds. So I might not measure 2 things that correlate so strongly with each other to predict the end outcome. And so in this case, they looked at the intercorrelations between tons of risk factors, 39 different risk factors that have been proven out in late onset dementia as risk factors, and said, how do those things interact statistically? And what's the best predictive model of the fewest items that I can measure that have the most potent effect on the risk for young onset dementia?
Yeah.
And so they went from 39 through multiple models and iterations down to 15 risk factors. I think kind of, I don't know if we want to skip right to the punchline.
Yes, we do.
But
yes, we absolutely do.
But and we can kind of pick apart any other part of the paper. But the punchline really is figure 2, where you can see that there are a number of risk factors, 15 listed here, that have potent effects on the risk of young onset dementia, the dementia diagnosed after people entered the study healthy and were followed for years, and before the age of 65 were diagnosed with a dementia by a physician, and that was written in the chart. And so that was the outcome that they were trying to predict. And they found that things like education level and hand grip strength, which we can pull apart a little bit, and some amount of alcohol use were protective against young onset dementia. Whereas things like C-reactive protein, a general marker of inflammation, or vitamin D level that was lower than 10, or the incident of depression or heart disease, diabetes, stroke, orthostatic hypotension, have low blood pressure when you get up, those things were risk factors. And if you look at a hazard ratio, you kind of start to think, well, what does that all mean? I'll just pick out a few that had pretty high hazard ratios. So depression had 3.25 hazard ratios. So it's 3.25 times the risk of having young onset dementia if you had depression as compared to not having depression. ApoE4, having two alleles of that, 1.87 times the risk. So less than depression.
Right.
Maybe that's a punchline in and of itself right there.
According to this paper, depression is a bigger risk factor for young onset dementia than ApoE4. Having two ApoE4 allele mutations.
Exactly.
Pretty incredible. What else? What one risk factor really jumps out at you here?
Well, the alcohol use one does, but that's because it's tricky, and we can kind of dig into that. But the social isolation is an interesting one. 1.53 times the risk of developing young onset dementia if you have social isolation. And I'll just pull up the way that was defined. I think that's important. So social isolation was defined as having contact with friends or family once a month or less versus more than once a month. And so it was protective, obviously, if it was more than once a month. Right. And so that's a really rudimentary, kind of fundamental, basic measure of social interaction. Social interaction is a pretty complex thing. Right. You know, we're calling people, texting people, interacting on social media. We're interfacing with people live.
And the dynamic of that social interaction.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, I think what science has shown us about social behavior and social isolation, or having social resource, if you will, or social capital, is that the feeling of loneliness, in fact, is the best predictor of bad things, bad outcomes, whether it be all-cause mortality or cognitive decline with aging, or risk or vulnerability to the common cold. The feeling of loneliness is a potent risk factor. And so I'm guessing this social isolation measurement is a proxy for kind of being lonely.
Yeah. My understanding is that loneliness is defined differently than social isolation, just because loneliness involves a specific feeling versus social isolation, involves just a context and an environment.
It could be correlated in many cases, right? Because some people who are isolated can feel lonely, and people who, have contacts, have friends and family they interact with on a regular basis can also feel lonely. So it's not a one-to-one correlation, but it's probably correlated.
Well, if it is, it's a big deal, because there's an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, and apparently about 1 in 2 adults in America reported experiencing loneliness. And I think that number was even higher. I think it might have been 50 to 70% in the teenage age demographic. No. So if we're looking at social isolation, potentially loneliness, as being a risk factor for young onset dementia, then we can think about how that's going to impact those populations from a public health standpoint.
And it's probably even worse. And I know there's data on this. I can't pull it up in my mind to quote a stat, but when there's loneliness in the context of dementia, in the middle of having the difficulties and deficits of dementia.
Exacerbates it. Yeah.
And so we should have a whole episode on it. I mean,
we are.
Part of my PhD was on social interaction and how that is influenced by brain structure and function.
Yeah. Can't not mention orthostatic hypotension, right? The hazard ratio is 4.2. It's the highest hazard ratio up there. What are your thoughts about it? My thoughts are orthostatic hypotension is very frequently experienced in the context of dementia as potentially a prodrome, like you would experience in Parkinson's dementia, or not. And there's a lot of reasons for you to have orthostatic hypotension that wouldn't necessarily be dementia. So certainly there might be some reverse causation there. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think, they actually did a reverse causality analysis where they can try to understand in time whether one of the risk factors identified could have been actually caused by the dementia rather than a cause of, even though we're talking about correlations. This is one technique they use. And it was kind of a strength of the paper to put these risk factors through multiple subsequent tests, looking at the effects of age, the effects of ApoE4, the effects of gender and sex, the effects of time here in this case. And so it does look like from their analysis, it's probably a prodrome rather than a risk factor for neurodegeneration. It's probably part of neurodegeneration rather than a risk factor.
But let's just say, if your systolic blood pressure is dipping below 20 when you stand up, that's not a good thing, right?
Below 20? No, it's not a good thing.
I'm sorry. If you have a drop in systolic blood pressure
of more
of
than 20. Right,
sorry,
right.
I misspoke. 20, definitely not.
Sure. If you have multiple episodes over a lifetime or over several years, the brain's not getting the oxygen it needs.
Right.
It's not going to be happy or developing the way it should.
And, then we start thinking about some of the other things: stroke, diabetes, heart disease, right? The sort of comorbid trifecta that we keep seeing as it relates to increased risk of dementia. I don't think that's very surprising there. Were you going to say something?
No, I mean, let's just look at the numbers, though. Stroke, 2 times the risk of developing dementia if you've got strokes. Diabetes, 1.65. Heart disease, 1.61, and so on. So, adding all those up, it's not good to have the trifecta cardiometabolic diseases.
Yeah. So all things that we should work on, definitely. Hand grip strength, protective. What do you think?
I think we agree. We've talked about this before. It's kind of a funny measurement, but maybe a proxy for the opposite of frailty, of strength, endurance, durability. Also maybe somewhat prodromal, as the neurodegeneration ensues, the individual might be moving less, might be becoming more frail, and in so doing might have a lower hand grip strength. But there's been a lot of studies actually that show measurable and incremental gains in outcome mortality with increasing different types of strength, hand grip strength, leg strength. And so I think it is probably a proxy for being durable, for not falling, not breaking a hip, for withstanding everyday life in a way that doesn't put you at risk of other things that can cause neurodegeneration or death in that case.
Yeah. But, certainly this is a good marker for frailty and overall muscle strength. But, I walked into my office the other day and I saw my assistant doing, hand grip strength exercises. And I'm like, what are you doing?
Right.
And he said, I'm working on preventing my dementia by doing this hand grip strength thing. And, that kind of leads me to the next thing of, it's a great marker for hand grip strength. And I came across a study that looked at, I think, about 200 elderly patients and actually did like a composite comprehensive muscle scoring strength test for them, where they accumulated basically a bunch of muscles throughout their body and came up with a single score. And one of them was hand grip strength, but they also involved other muscle scoring.
Right.
And, they found that increase in 1 unit of strength in that composite muscle strength table decreased people's risk of Alzheimer's disease by 60%. Interesting. But what was also interesting was they factored in, okay, is this prevention of dementia just because of the hand grip strength that we measured?
Right. Because
they understood the correlation. So they took hand grip strength out, and then they found that axial muscle strength and all these other muscle bodies that they measured also contributed to the prevention of dementia.
Cool.
Which kind of tells us it's obviously not, how strong you can grip something, but it's your overall muscle strength.
Yeah. A couple other things to point out, I think, are things that didn't make it into the model. So it's not a perfect study. They didn't have perfect measurements for every single aspect, like sleep, for example. In sleep, they, first of all, didn't find that it entered the final phase of the model, but they weren't measuring probably one of the most potent risk factors related to sleep for dementia, sleep apnea. Let me kind of just look here at what they used to measure sleep. So they found that they had variables for never sleepless, sometimes sleepless, and often sleepless. And so a 0, 1, 2. And essentially, that's how they came up with sleep as a risk factor. And so that's not the best measurement of sleep. That's not maybe the most accurate way or detailed way. And so maybe that's why it didn't make it to the model. Exercise was similar. They had a proxy for exercise. Diet was similar. These are all things that obviously we know are important, but if not measured in a way that makes sense, maybe they don't enter the final model here. Or maybe they interact with these other variables in a way that the other variables are more predictive. Maybe exercise, diet, and sleep are really just mechanistically related to blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke that ended up making it to the model. Maybe those are better predictors. But we can't know just from this study alone. Just figured it's worth mentioning.
So what about vitamin D status? I think vitamin D deficiency is regarded as less than 20. There certainly seems to be some risk with the 10 to 20 range of vitamin D status, but it's most pronounced less than 10. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that and C-reactive protein probably have something to do with inflammation in the body. Is it, a very specific marker? No. But is it worth considering in people who have an inflammatory profile? I think so.
Yeah, definitely. Anything else jumps out at you here?
I think that's some of the kind of high points of the finding. The rigor that they went through to ensure that the findings were not due to other factors like age or sex, for example, I thought were pretty strong. So, for example, they looked at not just age under 65, but also added people between 65 and I believe 70 or over 65 anyway, and tested, how that would change these risk factors, and or which ones were more potent in older ages versus younger. And so there's only a few, actually. Education ended up being more potent of a protective factor in later onset dementia. And then ApoE4 status. So both one allele and two alleles of ApoE4 had a much more potent effect on risk of late onset as compared to young onset. And so that was 2.67 times and 8.6 times increased risk for 1 and 2 alleles, respectively, for late onset versus in the 1.5 and almost 2 times risk for young onset. And the final thing is hearing impairment, which is interesting. We'll probably come back to it, but was more of a predictor of young onset rather than late.
Yeah. And you're right. We will come back to hearing impairment, and I was planning on bringing it up. Hearing impairment is a more significant risk factor than having one ApoE4 allele, which I thought was really striking. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this whole hearing impairment, social isolation, like the deprivation of stimulation, and how that relates to it being a risk factor for dementia.
Yeah.
It could be as simple and logical as like you don't use it, you lose it kind of a thing, but I'd like to hear a more eloquent reason from you.
I don't have one, man. I thought the same thing. If you don't have input, it's going to be very difficult for you to stimulate the brain the way that you would if you did have input. So blindness and or vision impairment and hearing impairment are definitely predictors of long-term cognitive difficulties in dementia.